After the October 7th massacre by Palestinian terrorist group Hamas, we've seen a wave or perhaps even tsunami of anti-Semitism, rhetoric, vandalism, assaults on social media, in real life, all kinds of places. And everyone I know in the Jewish community has been grappling with this on so many levels. And one of the angles that I've heard about this wave of anti-Semitism is that people cite DEI as one of the sources of this anti-Semitism. I was going to say growing anti-Semitism, but as Ben M. Freeman, a writer, says, it's not that anti-Semitism is rising, it's that it has risen. So the DEI is something, and I've noticed, so diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm not the expert in that, but I wanted to point out that I came across online in various articles, various authors speaking about this. Barry Weiss wrote an article recently called End DEI. Tabia Lee, who was a DEI officer, wrote, I was a DEI director. DEI drives campus anti-Semitism. And I came across an article by Dr. Stanley Goldfarb called How DEI Inspires Jew Hatred. So I'm honored to welcome as our guest Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, who's a nephrologist, former dean for curriculum, and co-director of the renal division, I believe, at the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine. Dr. Goldfarb, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. And I'm proudly Jewish also.
Nicely said. Now, I do think that most of my audience knows what DEI is, but for clarification, and perhaps for those that aren't as familiar, could you give us a brief explanation of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is? And they sound like good things. They sound like good values. Please tell us what it is in theory and perhaps what it is in reality.
Yeah, the words themselves are good value. You know, I'm the chairman of an organization called Do No Harm, and our organization is devoted to getting rid of all discriminatory activities in healthcare. That's we focus very narrowly on that. And the whole DEI regimen has been something that I've been interested for quite a while, written about it beyond that article that you mentioned. And the problem is, you're right, the words are in and of themselves fine, but what they've represented has really been something that, and also, as you mentioned, a number of authors have pointed out, really represents the consequences of identity politics. Now, you know, there's nothing wrong with people having identities and recognizing those, but the problem has been that this has been really misused in a way that I think has led very much to this rise in anti-Semitism. Because what it is, it represents just a focus on tribalism, really. It identifies groups of people, and it says the way we need to consider how we deal with these groups of people is we have to think about them as whether they're people who have been oppressed or people who are oppressors. And, you know, there's been a huge intellectual edifice that's been built up about this concept. It stems from sort of the postmodern theories of Foucault and Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Hall. And they've all come to see that the way we need to think about the way human beings interact is through this oppressor mindset. And I think DEI has come to represent the tools that ideology is using to try, which I suspect are well-intentioned to make the world a better place for people. But in fact, the consequences of thinking about the world in those terms have led to this anti-Semitism. So let me speak to it very specifically vis-a-vis what's going on in Israel now. So the Israelis are seen as the oppressors, and the Palestinian people are seen as the oppressed. Now, this isn't to say that there isn't some oppression, you know, going on, and that there isn't unfortunate, terrible things happening, but the idea that that DEI sort of has imposed is that if you're the oppressor, you can do no right. And if you're the oppressed, you can do no wrong. So instead of a morality and a set of ethics in which your actions have to be accounted for and you have to be seen as an individual that represents your own character and your own activities, you're seen as a member of a group. And if you go and enter from Gaza into southern Israel and kill 1,200 people, but you've been oppressed in the past by their criteria, that makes it valid. That makes it moral. And on the other hand, if you've been the oppressor, if you've lived on the border of Gaza and you've built up your kibbutz there and you've been successful, that success is a sign of your having oppressed someone. And therefore, you're entitled to be harmed because of that mentality. And unfortunately, on the campus, the view of the DEI regimen has been just that minority groups are oppressed, and whites, particularly white heterosexual men, are at the top of the intersectionality idea that of oppressor and oppressed, and that those individuals, because of the fact that they've been oppressors, can do no right, they have no moral standing, and those who are oppressed can do no wrong, and they can march down the street, they can intimidate people, they can scream that Jews should not exist in Palestine. Whatever they say is fine because of this mentality. So the diversity, equity, and inclusion world that's kind of grown up with this concept as their underlying concept, which justifies giving people special opportunities because of past discrimination. Ibram Kendi's famous lines that past discrimination requires as its remedy present discrimination, and present discrimination requires future discrimination. This means that discrimination can never end because the white heterosexual males are always going to be at the top of the intersectionality model of power and powerlessness. And therefore, we're going to be living in a world where people are going to be viewed as in these groups, and that's the only way we're going to encounter them. And I think that it's fairly natural that once you start down this path, you start to demonize a group that you don't like, a group that you've decided is in power. And that's, I think, what's really happened to the Jews. So any Jew that is near the idea of supporting Israel's position and thinking that Israel has a right to exist, by this sort of approach has been viewed as someone who's near the power, the oppressor side of the dyad, and therefore can do no right.
So,
and I think,
go ahead.
So I think that's really sort of the ideological construct that's behind this, and then the way it's played out has been, this awful idea that now it's not enough to criticize Israel, but people have a right to criticize any country's policies. But the fact that since Israel is an oppressing agent, that anyone who supports it, therefore, is morally corrupt and morally wrong.
I think you've answered my follow-up question. Anyone who supports it. But connected to that, we Jews, you mentioned that in this construct, DEI, it sees minorities as oppressed, and the have-nots are oppressed, and the haves are oppressors. Paraphrasing what you've said, Jews, we see ourselves. I don't think we categorize ourselves this way, but if we had to, historically, we would see ourselves as an oppressed people. I don't think we know of another people that have been marginalized as much and for as long as we have. Do you think that there's a disconnect between the way we see ourselves and the way that we are seen?
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the articles that's gotten my attention mostly lately was the one in the Wall Street Journal, whose title was "From What River to What Sea?" And that article said they interviewed a number of people, particularly young people, who are very much opposed to Israel's position in this conflict, and they had no idea that it was the Jordan River. They had no idea it was the Mediterranean. They thought it was the Ganges, the Nile. They just didn't know. When it was pointed out to them, they said, "Oh, well, maybe that's not right either." So I think the problem of the way people have seen the Jews has been the mythology or the ideas that have grown up over the years, they've come to accept them without understanding the real history here. And I think, of course, this represents a failure of education, a terrible failure of education. And in fact, this is not just against the Israelis, but of course it's against Western civilization in general. But I think what you say is absolutely right, that, I think if you understand history, if you know history, if you understand what the pogroms were like for, almost 100 years between the late 19th century and the middle of the 20th century, you understand that Jews end up having no other place to go when all was said and done. If they weren't accepted into America by 1921, they couldn't get to America. So they had no other choice but to go to Israel. And of course, there's been a Jewish presence there for, thousands of years on top of it all. But I think that's absolutely right. The history of Jews, the nature of the Jewish life in Palestine in Israel has not been well understood. And if one did understand that, I think this idea that Jews are this all-powerful group would be seen in the reality that actually exists. As there's this famous line that was in the Golda Meir movie. It's a wonderful movie, which I urge people to go see. But she's talking to Henry Kissinger on the phone about, this was the Yom Kippur War, which Israel almost lost that war. And she points out that, that Israel is not going to lose that war, and that Israel can't do anything because it has no place, we have no place else to go. And that's the reality of this idea. And, this idea that Israel has been colonized, and that this represents what the Palestinians are attempting to do is to create a post-colonial state. Of course, that only makes sense if the colony that's been put in place has some place to go after they've removed from the country in which they exist. The model, I think, for the Palestinian approach has been the model of Algeria, where the French left Algeria and went back to France. But the Israelis have no place to go. So the Israelis are not going to leave. So all of the protesting is, I'm afraid, sadly, is not going to lead to any cessation of hostilities, because, they cannot tolerate what's been happening there. So I think you're right. Jews themselves see that we have a long history of oppression. Fortunately, in the United States, we haven't really been oppressed up until this latest outpouring. But this I think represents a failure of education and a failure of understanding what the reality of the situation really is.
Now, you've already addressed this to some extent, but what were you seeing around you on campus, elsewhere, that made you want to write the article that you did, How DEI Inspires Jew Hatred? And you've underlined how Jews that if you support Israel, you are seen as colluding with an oppressor. But Jew hatred and to what extent? What were you seeing?
No, well, I mean, this goes back, of course, thousands of years, starting with Greek times, where Jews have always been seen as the other, and have, so there's no question that hatred of Jews has been a really unfortunate characteristic of, Western and Eastern civilization for many, many centuries now. I just think that this current ideology, whether you call it critical race theory, identity politics, whatever you call it, has sort of given it a specific philosophical underpinning. And again, that philosophical underpinning has sort of becomes a justification for it. It's not just enough to say we hate Jews because whatever they did to Christ, or whatever however they've behaved as commercial agents in various Middle Eastern cities over the centuries, or how they've been successful bankers, or what have you. That all this has been seen as sort of a negative aspect of their history. But I think What's different now is that these students, these young people, can march and think, well, we have a good rationale for this because we now understand that we have this oppressor-oppressed model, and that model gives us justification for what we're saying. I personally think that a lot of it is not anti-Semitism per se by many of these young people. After all, these are the young people that have, halted Halloween costume at Yale because they felt like these microaggressions were so harmful. I mean, these are young people that have said that anytime you give a slight to any group that's been oppressed, that's a terrible thing. And at the same time, they're willing to, walk down the street screaming and yelling of something that is akin to genocide of the Jewish people. I think that this whole idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has been, as I've said, the implementation of these ideas of critical race theory and identity politics, have given them a justification for the way they've behaved, and they're acting out against the oppressor as opposed to against Jews per se.
Thank you. One of the things that I've observed over the years is that, and I don't know that I made the correlation with DEI years ago, but that it was an ongoing campaign, and I still believe this, to make the genocide of half the world's Jewish population, justifiable and perhaps even a moral imperative on the grounds of restorative justice. So there's a movement out there that sees the eradication, the removal of the foreign Jew from Israel as removing colonialism, as removing, as righting a wrong. And the implication, you said the motivation may not be anti-Semitism per se, but the implication is the end result is the same. We're looking at terrible discrimination and violence. I wanted to talk about that October 7th massacre for a moment. That it's prompted a great deal of introspection and discussion within the Jewish community. And we've seen a huge spike in anti-Semitism, as we mentioned, particularly in universities. And you write, though, that you've been seeing hateful rhetoric for decades. Can you talk about that? I know you've already kind of mentioned that, but has it gotten worse? Where did it begin in this? And how much of a role did DEI play in this earlier on? Is this more of a recent kind of, how did this? If you have to draw this on a graph, what was the impact of DEI on this?
A lot of people have been, interested in that. There's no question that we've had an acceleration. I think we had this pandemic, and pandemics are known for having incredible social consequences as well as the medical consequences. And one of the obvious social consequences in the pandemic was the reaction to the death of George Floyd. And clearly there was a huge that was a huge event. It led in my field in medicine, the development of people who were deciding that, in fact, the healthcare disparities, which are very real phenomena in medicine, were due to racial injustice, and that, in fact, doctors were acting like the police, really, and were treating Black people in that particular case very differently. And there needs to be, some response to this. So there was this sort of huge outpouring. I think part of it was people were locked in their homes for so many months, and then all of a sudden they were given justification to get together and protest something they felt was terribly unfair and wrong. And I think that was probably an important turning point where this sort of became much more prominent. Now we had a bunch of institutions, particularly of higher education, that had been dabbling in this whole area, had been working through affirmative action efforts to try to increase the diversity of their institutions simply for the benefit of diversity, which, again, you could argue there really are some benefits to it, particularly at the undergraduate level and the high school and grade school level. It's important that people get to learn to deal with others of different backgrounds and all. But clearly, institutions jumped on this, declared themselves profoundly racist, and the need to get rid of all their racial animus that seemed to be embedded in the institutions, and that led to the creation of these bureaucracies for diversity, equity, inclusion. And then the bureaucracies went ahead and used the language of critical race theory and identity politics to sort of say, look, you white people, which, schools have said this and done this, you white people need to be separated out. You need to understand that you're responsible for what's happened to our country and the Western world, and that you are the implementers of this oppression, and you need to be held to account for it. And so I think that was a big turning point. Was suddenly all this became acceptable. The language became acceptable. The language that we talked about people in racial terms became much more acceptable. When I was in school and grew up, the idea was to get rid of these racial categories, to get rid of racialization of American life. And it had been very racialized. There's no question about it. I remember when I was in high school on a trip I grew up in New York, a trip to Virginia. And that was the first time in my life I'd ever seen segregated bathrooms. I thought this was the most bizarre thing I could imagine. And then suddenly, segregation became acceptable. It became acceptable to keep Black undergraduates in separate dormitories from white undergraduates, that have separate graduations, to have separate classes. We've documented that in our work, that this has gone on in medical schools. And I think that naturally led to this identity politics taking over our thinking. And again, here we had an event, this Palestinian uprising, and this reaction by the Israeli government against it. The ground was very fertile for this sort of outpouring of another example of identity politics, now with the Jews being the object of everybody's hate and violence.
In your article, you mentioned that it's essential to remove DEI. And from what you've said, I understand that would be, why you would say that. What about reforming it? Can it be reformed? Because when you look at the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, they sound, like we said at the beginning, it sounds good. But you said in reality, it works as a in a twofold. There's a duality to it: oppressor, and oppressed. It comes down to that. What if there was an effort to reform that and remove that from it and just focus on? Is that possible, or does it have to be taken out, as I think Barry Weiss says, root and branch?
I have to agree with Barry, whom I know and admire greatly. I think, unfortunately, what's happened is this bureaucracy has grown up, and people have been, have their careers committed to the model that was sustained. Look what's been the response to the Supreme Court's decision about getting rid of affirmative action in higher education admissions. The schools, and we monitor medical schools in particular, everybody's trying to figure out a way to get around this, because they're just so convinced that this is the model that we have to pursue in how we try to restructure American life. That all of the ideas that we should go back to the notion, the Martin Luther King, idealized notion that we should treat people based on their individual characteristics. And, the argument by the critical race theory people is you can't do that. This is not the way you view the world. You view the world as oppressor and oppressed. And we have a bureaucracy that we're putting in place to implement that view of the world and to fight against it. But the point is not to accept that view of the world, to accept the view that, Coleman Hughes spoke about in this famous TED Talk, where he said, sure, we look at people, we know they're of a different race, but we need to look beyond that. We need to look upon them as individuals. We need to treat everybody as an individual. It doesn't matter I don't care if the whole, incoming medical school class at Penn were Black or Asian or why. It doesn't matter. The whole point is, people that have the most merit and have worked hard should have an opportunity to advance. And whether they're white Jews or they're Black African Americans, or they're Ethiopians or South Americans or DACA, people, or whatever, it really doesn't matter. The question is that we should have a society in America that lives up to its ideals. And its ideals are that we're going to treat everybody as an individual, and that we're not going to deal with people on the basis of group characteristics. We have all these laws in our country that go against it. Our organization has sued lots of organizations who have broken the law. They've tried to deal with people based on their race and not on their personal characteristics, not their individuality. It's illegal in our country, and we shouldn't go and try to support it. And I think the idea that, I'm a Jew, and therefore, because I'm a Jew, I must be a supporter of Israel. And because I'm a supporter of Israel, if I walk down the street with a kippah, or I walk down the street with tzitzits, or any other manifestation of my religion, then I'm fair game because I'm part of this terrible group. No, I'm Stan Goldfarb. They need to know me. If they hate me because of who I am and how I've behaved, okay, they have a right to do that, but not because of this characteristic that I can't change. And
Right.
and that's really, I think, the point here.
And
So that's why getting rid of DEI is so important, because DEI is the bureaucracy that's implementing this ideology. And that's what we need to get rid of. We need to have this bureaucracy gone, because we don't need to treat Jews now as part of another protected class. We need to treat people as individuals and not as members of a group.
so on that note, just on a personal note, my skin is white, but my father's Moroccan. I'm a Moroccan Jew, and he's darker than I am. And I grew up not thinking about this as in any way. This had nothing to do with anything. I was proud of my heritage, period. And I didn't look at people's skin color and look at shades of this and shades of that and oppressions and all that. And he and his family had to flee Morocco with nothing. And as some of perhaps everybody here who's listening knows, Jews of the Muslim and Arab world were basically ethnically cleansed in the middle of the 20th century, and left with nothing. Moved to Montreal, my family, and he worked hard. And there were obstacles in his life that were based more on his being Jewish than being dark-skinned. And what I learned as a child of someone who had that experience was what you're saying, that it is about individual capacity and overcoming. I can't speak to everybody else's experience, but that has been my understanding. So to see in recent years, how people categorize neatly my father and me as white Jews, where that doesn't make sense. And what are the implications? What are you saying? We are privileged because we belong to this class of people. It's confusing to me, and a bit there's a disconnect. So I guess so. Thank you for listening to me. I don't have a question in that, but I'm hearing what you're saying about personal merit versus identity. Belonging. I'm very proud of my identity, and that's not what gives me the keys to get through, university or to get a job. It's because of accomplishments. I did want to mention on regarding universities. We saw the other day, 2 weeks ago, I think it was now, this remarkable hearing in Congress with 3 presidents, right? MIT, Penn, and was it Harvard?
Yes.
Yeah. And now Penn president Liz McGill subsequently resigned. This is, for those who don't know, they had a lot of trouble identifying calling for the genocide of the Jewish people as bullying or hate speech. So eventually, I'm summarizing in brief, Liz McGill resigned. How was their failure in that appearance related to DEI, in your view? And will McGill's resignation, perhaps the other 2, change anything?
Well, I think it's going to change things. To answer the second part first, is because I think suddenly college or presidents and other leaders realize that now people are paying attention. Suddenly they understand what's really going on. The Penn trustees that really forced McGill's resignation by saying they were going to withhold their giving. One prominent one said $100 million gift is off the table now because of the way she's behaving. And Mark Rowan, who was the head of the overseers of the Wharton School. You know, a lot of the major titans of Wall Street came out of the Wharton School and were huge supporters of Penn. You know, they all said the same things. And so I think college presidents all over the place, Harvard, Yale, where have you, they're all in the docket now potentially to answer these questions and see what their attitude is. I think the reason that this is related to DEI is because what bothered people a lot about their whole response, particularly to Congress, was that while they couldn't bring themselves to say, yeah, anybody who says that we're calling for the genocide of the Jewish people, of Israelis, that's a terrible thing, that's intimidation, that shouldn't be allowed. Their comment was, well, you have to understand the context of which that is said. Now, I think the point they were trying to make is, you know, some kid screaming that without understanding what it really meant was not posing a threat to the Jewish people. That was one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is, if you're a Jew and you hear somebody screaming at you, you know, you need to be killed. That's pretty intimidating. So their ability to sort of elide the consequences of that kind of language bothered people. But what bothered people even more, and Penn is a perfect example of this, is that this has been very, very selective application of DEI. And that's the problem with DEI, because it's only the whole DEI regime is only aimed at one group of people, and that's a particular group of minorities, and they're listed. You know, it's African Americans, it's Hispanics, it's you know, Pacific Islanders. They have it all laid out of who falls into these categories, and those people are treated differently than everyone else because of, you know, their historical minority status. And the great example at Penn was this professor, Amy Wax, who's a professor of law and who's actually someone I know quite well. And Amy Wax is a very brilliant woman. She's an MD and a law professor. She's a very prominent teacher in the law school. And, you know, she made a bunch of statements that she felt were the reality of how she viewed the minority students that she taught in her classes. She said they weren't performing very well academically. For this, she was labeled as a racist, and the school has tried to remove her. They've tried to remove her tenure, and they've treated her very poorly. Now, you could argue, I don't disagree with Amy Wax, she shouldn't have said those things, but you can't say that her comments, which, you know, in lots of ways are, you know, are sort of titillating and almost seek attention, I guess. But you can't say she doesn't have a right to say these things. And yet the students that scream for the genocide of the Jewish people, we have to understand the context of which they're saying this. So I think the thing that's driven most of us really to great anger over this has been the hypocrisy of their approach. You know, if they want to adopt the University of Chicago principles, which is you just don't comment about any kinds of political things, you just stay out of it as an institution of higher education and let people say whatever they want on campus. Okay, I can live with that, but I can't live with the fact that people like Amy Wax and frankly, people like myself, I've been denounced by people on the Penn's campus in official statements because they felt that my view of DEI and my view of the need to treat everybody as individual, and if they do poorly, bring it to everyone's attention, unrelated to what their race might be. That's been viewed as racist behavior. And, you know, it's the hypocrisy that's been so awful. And again, I think DEI, because it's decided that one group of people, the oppressed people, should be treated differently, just feeds into this kind of mentality.
Thanks, Dr. Goldfarb. I want to invite anyone who has a question to place it into I know some people have already started, but place it in the chat. I'll do my best to answer it, to pose the question to Dr. Goldfarb with the time that we have left. But please do so.
You almost called me Rabbi Goldfarb.
I did. I almost did. You caught that, huh?
I did go to the yeshiva Flatbush, so I do have. There was some potential there, but I did not have the intellectual capacity to be a rabbi.
Oh, that's nicely said. There was a question that someone asked in connection to what you mentioned about the universities. Were the people, this is by Ruth Oxman, were the people pulling their donations Jewish? Were there, as far as you know?
Many of them. I don't, there have been a lot of them. I can tell you that. But I think certainly at Penn, I think that was, the story at Penn was a little bit more complicated. It started with an event that the Penn campus held about that was called Palestinian Rights, and it was a literary sort of convention that was held. But a lot of the speakers that were invited were notorious for their clear anti-Semitic statements. Roger Waters, the famous, the entertainer, who was just blatantly anti-Semitic. He hasn't played games about this being anti-Israel or anti-Zionist. These alumni, these donors, were very upset about that. Almost, pretty much, mostly Jewish donors. Again, I don't know that they all were. So that kind of laid the groundwork for this as well. And what they were concerned about is that the university let this go on. Well, okay, but if you have speech rules on campus which prevented Amy Wax from speaking her mind, then you ought to apply them equally across all of the people. If you don't have speech rules, then fine, let everybody speak the way they wanted. So they didn't come out and really criticize this convention forcefully enough, and that's what led many of the donors to feel that way. But this has been a very widespread phenomenon, this donor reluctance, and I think. But are they mostly Jewish? I don't know. Certainly, the most prominent ones have been, yes.
Right. And without knowing this, I simply would say, I suspect the question is there because you want to know that we're supported by others. But I think it's fantastic that we lead the way. This is our cause. Jewish interests should be, fought for by Jews at the forefront. It'd be nice to know that we're not alone in this, I think. There's another question here. DEI has been around for a long time. By Carolyn here. Why hasn't the Jewish community fought harder in the past to promote history and understanding of the Jewish people? So I think, go ahead.
I think it's a good question. I think the understanding that this was going to lead to anti-Semitism has just been a recent event. And I think, the Tikkun Olam notion, very much fits into the idea that, minority groups have been treated poorly in the past, and there's a desire to do things for them and to help them. That's the empathetic history of Jews. I mean, any group that's been harmed itself, it can be more sensitive to what harm is like and how it can be responded to. So I understand that impulse, but at the same time, we're also Americans, and we're also Western civilization practitioners, and we believe in Enlightenment principles, and we believe in individuality, and that's why I think now we're starting to respond to it. But I think, I've talked to many groups of Jewish physicians now who have been very much alarmed at what's happened, and several of them, were fellow travelers of the DEI world, believed in it, thought that this was the right way to deal with any difficulties in the various minority communities in our country. And suddenly they realize, no, it's not the right way to deal with it. This is not the solution. The solution is not to have identity politics take over. The solution is to make sure that there's wonderful education systems so that everybody can reach their potential. That's really the solution. The solution is not to create these unfortunate discriminatory practices that are just going to lead to more divisiveness. I've been writing about this in healthcare for the last 4 or 5 years now. Our organization has been saying it. And I think people sort of looked at me and said, oh, well, come on, really, things aren't that bad. And now they understand. I think people are starting to understand. The Jewish doctors that I've talked to now understand this is the consequence of having this DEI regimen in place in healthcare and in higher education and other aspects of American life. Just leads to divisiveness, and the Jews inevitably, are going to be one of the recipients of this divisiveness and this hate.
Marnie Horesh asks, how do we change? I think you've already addressed this to some extent. How do we change or get rid of DEI if the people who are behind it don't care about the impact it is currently having on Jews?
Well, my organization has focused on this in three ways, and I'll just mention it briefly. One is we've tried to go to the public. We've written lots of op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and other publications. Number two is we've conducted several lawsuits where we identified discriminatory practices. But the place where we've really had, I think, the most impact is in the legislative arena. So there are a bunch of states that we've worked in. Oregon certainly isn't one of them, but a number of states have now passed laws that say, no, universities cannot have DEI bureaucracy. So this was recently just announced by the governor of Oklahoma, who did it as an executive order and just said, no, get rid of your DEI offices in the university. So I think once the bureaucracy is deconstructed, then, this activity will start to change. And I think then we'll start to see people not feel like they have to speak in a particular coded language in order to progress in their academic careers. Unfortunately, I'm not a great friend and advocate for the government to be involved this way, but sometimes there's no other way to do it. And so I think what you're going to see is, and now there have been many states, I think there are about a dozen states now that have said their public institutions, their public universities that are funded by the states are not allowed to have DEI kinds of bureaucracies, are not allowed to demand that their professors sign a pledge for diversity as an important goal of their academic careers, and rather speak about just identifying meritocracy as their goal and having the strongest academic institutions that they can have. So I think we're going to start to see it deconstruct amongst several Midwestern and Southern states, and then we'll have a debate in our country about this in a really robust way.
And I think that this is that many people beyond the Jewish community have issue with this. And I suspect that if it were just a Jewish issue, it may not go that far. But because there are a lot of people already on the same page, there's a chance. I want to field two more questions before we conclude our time together, as Dr. Goldfarb has another engagement after this. Dr. Goldfarb, Riley Atkins says, are you aware of the College Climate Initiative established to interface with college administrators to protect Jewish students? My own concern is trying to have Jews fit under the DEI victim status, which is a premise of the initiative. We Jews don't want to be victims.
Yeah, I know, this is, I don't know that particular one, but I know this has been what's been proposed. Bill Ackman, who's been one of the leaders of the push against Harvard, a very successful Wall Street entrepreneur, financier, has been really the leader against Harvard. And that's one of the things he's asked for, is that DEI include Jews. Again, the reasons that we said is I don't want anybody to have special status because of things that they have nothing to do with in terms of creating it. So Jews, because they're Jews, should not be treated differently than, white Protestants or anyone else. And I just think that as soon as you go down this identity politics hole, rabbit hole, then inevitably divisiveness occurs. If your listeners were interested in one particular book, I think that's incredibly beneficial. It's called The Identity Trap by Yascha Mounk. Mounk is a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins, an avowed man of the left, but he's written about this in ways that he gives the background, the history of postmodern kind of thinking that's led to this, and points out how divisive this is and what the consequences of it are. And it just needs to go away. It needs not to be the way that American life is organized.
Another question here. I'll try to squeeze in a couple more if we have the time, but Elizabeth Davis, I run a corporate DEI program, and I've worked hard to transform how DEI is perceived and functions is not at all tied to virtual signaling, identity politics, and oppressor oppressed. I realize the program I created is a unicorn. One thing I have done is push the company to recognize Jews as a people and our need to be inside the circle when they talk about minorities. They've made a little movement, and I've tried to connect them to Project Shema, but it's an uphill battle to segregate how DEI is currently administered and what it could be. And I think you hear what she's saying, and I think you've addressed it. In your view, the whole thing is not salvageable. These efforts may be noble, but won't be the way. Is that would I be correct in assessing your view of that approach?
Sure, but I think we got to we've got to try to be open to ideas. We can't just be narrow-minded about, okay, this is impossible. Anybody who says the word diversity is really a bad person. I don't feel that way at all. Unfortunately, though, because there's a whole industry regarding this that gives courses and forces people into a certain way of thinking, that to be heterodox in the field is very, very difficult. Is it impossible? No, I guess it's not impossible. I mean, someone can create a program where you say, look, I want us to start treating each other as human beings and not think about it this way, and make sure that everybody is treated equally. If that's the solution and you want to call that a diversity program, I'm all for it. I just think that the basic structure of it, the basic ideology that underlies it, if that ideology continues to be accepted, the ideology of critical race theory and identity politics, then it needs to be torn down completely. If you change your underlying ideology, then call it whatever you want. But you're saying we're not going to treat anybody differently. We're not going to have quotas for we're not going to decide that our next 3 hires are going to be people of a certain race. We're going to pick the best people that come in, and we're going to make sure that when we do hire a Black person, that their merit is not undermined by the fact that they've been hired in the past because of their skin color, which has been incredibly damaging, and something that Black intellectuals like John McWhorter and Glenn Loury have really, railed against, because these are brilliant men, for example, that should never be considered anything other than brilliant public intellectuals. But once you start going down this path of hiring people on the basis of skin color, then you've undermined their great merit and their ability.
Thank you. We're almost done here. There are 2 questions. I said 2 questions a while ago, but there are 2 here that I think are worthwhile, and then we'll wrap it up. Do you think, Ron Fromstein, there's any way to get university students to see the conflict, I think the Israel-Palestine conflict, in a fairer or more nuanced way? Is there a path toward any kind of civil dialogue or exchange on campuses on this front?
Sure. I think you can say, look, we're now going to have some different required courses next year. You're going to have to come in and we're going to have a professor from Middle Eastern Studies and a professor from Jewish Studies. They're going to co-teach a course and make you understand both sides of this position, hear the debate, hear it in a rational way, and then come away and understand what the history of this particular conflict is. And I think the same is true. We're going to make sure you understand where Western civilization comes from. We're going to make sure you understand that when we tell you about critical race theory, you understand it's one of multiple theories of the way social groups interact. It's not the only one, and it's not the only way to think about it. So I think what we're talking about is an improvement in the educational system. You just can't tell them, okay, now think differently. We're going to have to teach them differently. And I think if we do that, sure, there's hope. Young people are very resilient, and the same ones that were occupying offices one year are have their names on the doors of large offices 20 years later. So I think I'm always hopeful about that, but it's going to require educational effort. Yeah.
Is your message the same? This is related to Raul's question here. Is your message the same to fellow Jews, in particular Jewish students, who subscribe to DEI and are perhaps more critical of Israel? And Raul adds, people who continue to support DEI in this country, even though it harms Jews. So is there a different message, or is the message the same to fellow Jews, particular Jewish students, who continue to embrace DEI, even though one may believe, hey, this is actually harming us?
I think I would just, again, make this distinction about arguing against specific Israeli policies. I mean, we should be able to say, I don't agree with, for example, with their judicial reform that they tried to do. I personally didn't feel that way, but that's a legitimate concern that the Israelis themselves had about their own governmental policies. And I think the Jewish students are arguing about that. I think what they need to understand is they need to hear a little bit more about the Israeli position, and they need to think a little bit more clearly about what options the Israelis really have in this whole conflict. So they're declaring a ceasefire, but if they understood the history of ceasefires, the history of this effect, what happened in the Second Intifada, where that sprang up in the middle of efforts at peace treaties, they would understand that there's a long history here, and you need to understand this history before you go and decide that you understand what policies ought to be implemented at this point. So I think they're more open to, or it's more possible than an educational approach. I don't think they're hating Jews in that instance. I think they're hating specific policies, and they need to understand the origin of those policies better.
Okay. One final question. This is from me as we wrap up. Crystal ball regarding DEI and the impact on anti-Semitism. You have a crystal ball. In your opinion, is it going to get better or is it going to get worse?
Yes. I do think it's going to get better. I think this has been a watershed moment. I think now institutions are going to have to come to grips with this. I think they're being called. This question is being called. The sunlight is a wonderful disinfectant, and now we're seeing what's going on. I think people in America, for the most part, are appalled by this anti-Semitic outburst. This is not what our country has accepted and stands for. And I think we're going to see improvements, but it's going to be a battle. It's going to be a conflict, and people need to, make sure they understand, what their positions are, think it through carefully, inform themselves as much as possible about the various aspects of their positions so that they can argue forcefully when, we come next Thanksgiving and families get together or over the holidays.
Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, thank you so much for joining me today for this really engaging conversation. You've given us a lot to think about, and thank you for making the time to have this conversation with me and with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was great. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.